John Westerdahl, who will say a few words to us. He is the Director of Wellness and Lifestyle Medicine at Castle Medical Center.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of Seventh-day Adventist Churches of Hawaii and also Castle Medical Center, which is the Seventh-day Adventist Hospital here in Hawaii, we'd like to welcome you to tonight's program. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church of Hawaii, as well as Castle Medical Center, commends Dr. Campbell for the outstanding work that he has done over these many years in the scientific nutritional science research areas, in the study of plant-based diets and vegetarian nutrition for the improvement of human health. So we thank you for being here. We thank you, Dr. Campbell, for being here with us this evening.
Colin Campbell, Ph.D., is Director of the ongoing China-Oxford-Cornell Diet and Health Project. He holds the endowed chair of Jacob Gould Sherman, Professor of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. He was trained at Cornell, received his master's degree and his Ph.D. there, and was a research associate in nutrition, biochemistry, and toxicology at MIT. He's participated in multiple deliberations on state, national, and international policy matters and has authored over 300 research papers. Please join me in welcoming Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
I would like to take this opportunity of thanking some people for the invitation for me to come here to Hawaii to give 3 lectures, this being the 3rd. In particular, I'd like to thank Jim Brown of the Vegetarian Society, Dr. Westerdahl, of course. I don't always get a chance to talk to people who are so friendly with the vegetarian idea, but it is a pleasure. I want to talk to you about how did I come to this particular point of view myself through the years. I actually had a principal interest in nutrition in general, and more specifically in the relationship between diet and cancer, which gradually expanded over the years to diet and other issues concerning health and disease. I actually started out on the farm milking cows, and eventually went away to Cornell University to do a doctorate in figuring out how to grow cows more efficiently so we could eat more of them and drink more of their milk. And I would never have guessed some 35, 40 years ago that I'd be standing here today talking about a topic that I'm going to be talking about, namely vegetarianism. The question that is sometimes asked me by some of my colleagues is, how did you ever get here? What did you do? When did you fall off the turnip truck? That question I've asked myself. You know, how did I come to this particular point of view? Because being in very traditional science is really a rather different world in many ways, so-called establishment science, if you will, that doesn't take very well to this notion of a plant-based diet and vegetarianism for a number of different reasons. And so I wonder oftentimes myself, how did I end up this way? And I can honestly say, I think, that the major reason I did is because of the data, because of the evidence. Evidence of various and sundry kinds that I got involved in with a large number of students, research associates, postdocs, visiting professors, colleagues in other universities. And so it was really the weight of the evidence that convinced me finally, gradually to some extent, but nonetheless finally, I guess, as a result of the findings that we got from the so-called China study, which of course was a study of humans in China. A study, incidentally, that was the first major project that was jointly funded by the United States and the Chinese government back in the early days when our 2 countries started to talk with each other. But prior to the China study, which was big and comprehensive and we measured lots of things, I was involved in a number of other sort of more traditional kinds of questions and investigations that kind of set the stage for at least forming some hypotheses about what we might at least investigate and think about. And one of the things that was prominent in the late 70s was something I want to show you here in this first slide. This slide is one that was shown numerous times in the late 60s, early 70s, on into the 80s, and still is shown quite a bit in these days. And what it really shows is the relationship between dietary fat intake and breast cancer for a number of different countries. And you can see there's a very impressive relationship. The higher the fat intake, the higher the breast cancer rates. And of course, similar plots like this were also prepared for dietary fat and colon cancer, for dietary fat and heart disease for different countries. And you can see, of course, the United States is near the top. This was dominating our thinking in the 1970s, 60s, and 70s. Putting that notion of fat intake on that x-axis and comparing it with breast cancer led, in fact, to a great deal of interest in fat intake. And so as a result of that sort of preparation, that kind of observation, you've heard this story. During the last 20, 30 years or so, public information of all kinds have focused on fat as a primary cause of breast cancer and other similar diseases. More specifically, saturated fat, if you will, at least for heart disease and cholesterol. It was very focused just on fat. And I was on one of the members of the National Academy of Science panel in the early 1980s that reviewed the literature on diet and cancer. And we at that time were the first ones to be asked to put together an official document on how the diet and cancer relationship was really related. And we finally settled on this idea of making a recommendation to reduce fat intake from around 35 or 40% or so down to 30%. And that 30% figure has kind of stuck around for the years. And so we've had all this emphasis on fat. Now I must tell you, though, that although it might have been a good guess, it was a guess in some ways. It's true, as one increases fat intake in experimental models with animals, for example, you can actually increase the growth of tumors, mammary tumors, and so fat does play a role for sure. But the idea of just focusing on just fat alone actually got us onto a rather narrow gauge track and sort of missed the big picture. And so I want to lead you from this slide to the big picture. Just one other observation, incidentally, was made numerous times during the 60s and 70s, namely, as people migrate from one region of the world to another, and there's been dozens of these kinds of studies now, and as they sort of migrate and don't mix their genes up with the local population, in other words, they don't intermarry, and these are studies for the most part of people who did not intermarry with the local population, they take on the risk of the disease of the country to which they move within a generation or so, maybe a little more. What that suggested in a very profound way was that disease occurs as a result of dietary and lifestyle practices, because when people move and they change their environment, and they change their diet, in particular over some years, then therefore they get the disease according to how they change their diet. And it's not a question of genes. I put that little stop sign down there at the bottom. There seems to be an enormous amount of interest that we get disease because of our genes. And lots of money have been spent on that notion. I don't agree. Everything starts with genes. Yes, that's true. But genes alone do not determine disease. In fact, it's the expression of the genes, especially caused by nutrient intake and dietary practices, that really play a major role. Now, if we conclude, as we were likened to do in the late 70s and early 80s, if we conclude that this is a dietary question, and we did, and many others did too. Eventually, this led to some national recommendations and policy developments, and there was a consensus that emerged in the middle 80s or so, early 80s, middle 80s, late 80s. There was a consensus that emerged on a very conservative estimate of how much cancer could be prevented by let's say, changing our diet. And it was estimated about a third of all cancers could be prevented if we ate right. That ranked with stopping smoking and preventing lung cancer as a major cause of cancer. That 35% figure was conservative. There were estimates at that time that maybe to 70 to 80% or so of cancers could be prevented by appropriate dietary means. And I'm inclined to think that, in fact, if we really did things really well and ate right, we could save at least 90% of all cancers, if not, in fact, more. Now, if we agree that diet that nutrition is really that important in preventing cancer and heart disease? One of the practical and first questions, observation that one might make is, well, what are we talking about here? Can we achieve this good nutrition, let's say, through eating foods? That seems obvious. Or can we achieve it through using nutrient supplements? That's not the way to do it. We don't get our nutrition out of pills. We get our good nutrition out of food. And it was that notion and that bias on my part, at least, that was somewhat the basis for the China study. These are just some observations of advantages and disadvantages of the two different approaches, the nutritional approach and the pharmaceutical approach. The pharmaceutical approach is one where we use a single nutrient and try to achieve something. Let's say, prevent a disease, a very complicated, very biologically complex disease by just taking out one nutrient and making it work that way. We might, on occasion, get some results, and we do. We, on occasion, get some results that look like a beneficial result, at least in the short term. But we don't really have any good evidence, in spite of spending now over $100 million in numerous studies. We don't really have good evidence that really any nutrient supplement really works in the long term to reduce disease, in spite of all the efforts to do so. And when I talk about nutrients, I'm not talking about the 20 or 30 or 40 or so that get listed in textbooks that you can name, the vitamins, the minerals, the protein, the carbohydrate, and so forth and so on. I'm actually talking about all those things and all the analogs that come with them, and there's hundreds and maybe thousands of different kinds of variations of each of the individual nutrients. So I'm talking about almost a countless variety of chemicals present in food that tend to work together. Now, when I started out my career, as I indicated before, the main nutrient, if you will, that sort of dictated good health was protein. And I'm sure you probably thought about that a lot yourself. People often ask me, where do I get my protein from, particularly if they become vegetarians or vegans? Protein seems to have dominated our thinking for so long. It's almost a sacred nutrient for now over 100 years, maybe 150 years since it was first discovered. It was discovered in 1839, incidentally, by a Dutch chemist by the name of Gerhard Mulder, who gave it the name protein. He took it from the Greek word proteos, which means of prime importance. So it got off to an auspicious start, and many of the leading lights of the day during the 1800s and early 1900s really got onto this idea that protein was a symbol of civilization. It really was. There were medical doctors, for example, that represented the colonial powers who went to some of the developing countries and defined developing countries and defined people within developing countries as to their degree of civilization by how much protein they actually consume. It was, in fact, about protein, and more particularly, it was about animal protein. Most people thinking about protein up until the recent days, when you measure protein and you think about where I'm going to get my protein from, most people think of protein almost synonymously with meat, because meat is a good source of protein. Meat has the kind of protein, in fact, is sufficiently utilized compared to plant protein. And so when people talked about protein during the last 100, 150 years or so, it was really sort of the code word for meat. And so when I did my own work as a graduate student, more specifically my topic that was more or less given to me by my professors was to figure out how to produce animal protein more efficiently. Protein was at the center of the plate, or let's say meat is at the center of the plate. You've heard the story. One of the first responsibilities I had for some 10 years prior to the China study that actually had an influence on my thinking on this was that I was responsible for coordinating a nationwide program of feeding malnourished and starving children in the Philippines and working with unfortunate children such as shown here. As we sort of asked the questions of what to do, with such children, everybody in the nutrition community basically said that malnutrition amongst children of the world in the poor countries was related to their not getting enough, on the one hand, energy or calories, or on the other hand, not getting enough protein. And so there's a lot of emphasis given to the idea that these kids that are starving and malnourished in the world are that way because they're not getting enough protein. However, On a golf course one day, when I was, in fact, with one of my colleagues who was the medical advisor to President Marcos, he told me about operating on children 4 years of age and younger for primary liver cancer. And primary liver cancer, incidentally, is fairly common in the Philippines. It's fairly common in some of the poorer countries of the world. Primary liver cancer tends to occur only at, let's say, age 30, 40, 50 or so and above. Well, learning, in fact, that children age 4 and under were actually getting liver cancer was certainly an observation that didn't go unnoticed. It was a reflection, it was an indication in many ways, at least in my mind, of a very serious problem in the Philippines insofar as liver cancer is concerned. But the interesting thing about that observation was that the children who were getting the liver cancer, for the most part, were coming from families who were eating the most protein. And were eating diets the most like Westerners do. More protein. And here we're going there to tell or to arrange for opportunities for these children to get more protein in their diets, when in reality, the people who were getting the most protein were getting the most cancer, at least liver cancer. And so then there was a report from India by a man by the name of Dr. Gopalan, who subsequently became a very famous international nutritionist, incidentally, in Hyderabad. But Dr. Gopalan and his colleague did a study with experimental animals, rats in this particular case, worked with a chemical carcinogen referred to as aflatoxin, causes liver cancer, by the way. We were discovering it incidentally in human food too, and maybe it was responsible for liver cancer. And so he did an experiment using rats, each group of which, 2 groups here in this particular case, were exposed to aflatoxin that could lead to liver cancer. And what he did, he simply fed them two different levels of protein. One 20%, and 20% was the average intake that both people and experimental animals at least were getting. It turns out experimental rats and people more or less require about the same amount of protein. They're very similar in terms of requirements. They're very similar, almost identical in terms of the kind of response that they actually produce. So basically, he had one group that was given 20% protein, and the other group was given what was considered to be a deficient intake of protein, 5%. And what he learned was something rather striking. Namely, the animals given the regular levels of protein, they're the ones that got the liver cancer, 100%. The one that's given the lower levels of protein did not. Well, that coincided with what, in fact, I learned from my friend Dr. Caedo in the Philippines. And what we saw ourselves is that people and animals respond in sense to increasing intakes of protein. This, in turn, led to a lot of studies of my own and my students leading up to the China Project and even beyond, funded by NIH, where we wanted to explore this question because it was so provocative. I mean, how could protein cause cancer? I mean, this is the question. No one wanted to hear that, and I certainly was not led to believe that that could be the case. And so we did studies exhaustively for the next, actually 26 years, 19 years of which was funded by NIH, to figure out whether this is really true, and more to the point, try to figure out how did it work, because quite frankly, when you're studying these kind of questions, you never can sell anybody on anything really in this area unless you can establish how it works. If you can establish how it works, what's the mechanism, then therefore you can get some validity to the idea. This in turn led to a number of different studies. One of which is shown here. If experimental animals are just simply fed just good protein, either regular levels 20% or 5%, which is inadequate, and then followed over a period of time, it turns out that we eventually learned that we could turn on and turn off tumor growth just by this very good protein that we were feeding. These animals, in fact, had been exposed to the aflatoxin that was alleged to also be causing human cancer too, but nonetheless it was a question of protein. Very dramatic results. And eventually we concluded those studies some years ago now, doing an exhaustive sort of lifetime type of study to really get this idea down well established. And it turned out that the animals that were fed the 5% protein said to be inadequate, and compared them to animals fed 20% and halfway in between, and just to see how the protein would influence their health. And it turned out that the animals fed the 5% protein diets all were living and were healthy and were thrifty and had sleek coats and very playful and jumping around at 100 weeks. All the animals that fed the regular levels of protein were all dead with liver cancer. So we had, in fact, confirmed what the Indian workers had established in the first place. It was a very dramatic effect of protein doing this. That basically shows that we could turn on and turn off tumor growth just simply by feeding them protein. So finally, I had to face up to the proposition of what kind of protein were we using. It was the same kind of protein other experimentalists had used too for years, and still for the most part do today. It was casein. And casein represents 87% of cow's milk protein. Casein actually, when consumed at, let's say, more or less routine levels of intake, can turn on tumor growth. It can increase the risk. It can speed up whatever tumors might be growing in our bodies, for example. Of all the chemical carcinogens that you've heard about, we've heard about, whether it's ALAR, DDT, whatever, the most prominent chemical carcinogen we consume is casein. Now, it turns out also that I suspect, even though this has not been fully tested, other animal proteins too act in a very similar fashion. So animal protein, which had been ignored for so long, and which we thought, in fact, was so important, actually tends to turn on cancer. And the evidence is deep. There's multiple mechanisms. I just simply list here, for those of you who may be in science, the kind of evidence, in fact, that we had. I consider the evidence to be deep, to be relevant in the sense that it's the regular levels of protein intake that cause this. And finally, the evidence is broad. That is to say, this protein effect is involved more than just a simple, narrow model involving liver cancer. It involves breast cancer and pancreatic cancer and some other cancers, as we began to learn. But more to the point, this last entry here, we actually tried 20% soy protein and 20% wheat protein. That's the regular levels that lead to cancer in the case of casein. It didn't do it. So plant proteins don't do this. Animal proteins do it. Now, having sort of arrived at that particular point, I really wanted to go on to obviously be involved in doing human studies. And I fully and totally respect the views of the society, incidentally, insofar as animal experimentation is concerned. Obviously, I did it myself for many years. Didn't quite have the same views then as I do now, but nonetheless, that was part of my story, and I had to obviously tell that part of the story because that kind of information, ironically, is what's gotten me here to really begin to broaden my horizon and consider, the whole question concerning, a much larger question concerning, what not only do we eat, but what's some of the philosophy behind the ideas of what we eat and how do we do our work. So we wanted to give a broader picture. We don't want to have this trade-off kind of thing. Do we make a choice of whether to get heart disease or cancer, or choice of this or choice of that? I had the impression that if an animal protein had such a prominent effect on cancer, that maybe it had a similar effect on some other things too, and we should get quite serious about that. So we asked that question. And then secondly, we wanted to ask questions concerning what about other kinds of nutrients beside protein. Plants have protein too, but they have also countless other nutrients present. We were interested in looking at patterns of diets and patterns of disease that would emerge. But in science is a very important question, because in science we tend to look at questions in a very narrowly focused way. And we look at great depth. We tend to look at one chemical at a time doing one thing, and that's not the way we really live our lives. And so to look at things more comprehensively, it requires a different kind of mindset, different kinds of methodologies in order to do this. So, now to investigate this comprehensive nutrient effect, we wanted, of course, to do an appropriate human study, and it was at that point in the early 1980s that I learned that the Chinese government had established that cancer, for about a dozen different cancers, was very different in different parts of the country. And also at that time, I learned about that, in part because the Nova TV program had shown it. But at the same time, one of the first, in fact, I think he really was the first major scientist from China to come to the United States, was in my laboratory working with me, Dr. Chen Junshi, a very significant man in the Chinese medical establishment. He and I and a man named Richard Peto, now Sir Richard Peto, the University of Oxford, and another gentleman from China are the ones who really got the whole thing going to get this study going. And one of the interesting things about the opportunity in China to study this question concerning diet and disease was the fact that if animal protein and the stuff that comes with it, in other words, animal foods, if that is really significant in causing, let's say, disease, it would be really nice to do this kind of study in a place, let's say, where they weren't consuming much animal protein. Because if we saw something there, that's significant. That is really significant. In other words, small intakes. And in China, it turned out that from one county to another that we surveyed, they were consuming somewhere near almost no animal protein in some places, all the way up to a high of 20% of their total protein was animal protein. So somewhere between 0 and 20%. In our country, the percentage of protein coming from animal sources is 70%. Their average was 10%. And also the fact that they're consuming less protein, it turned out the concentration of the animal protein in the Chinese diet was only 1/10 of what it is here. So we were looking at a population where there's not much protein really being consumed. I didn't expect to see anything, to be honest about it. Once we came to that recognition and had that information, I didn't really expect to see much, because it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to produce an effect. So the study was organized in rural China, where people tend to live in the same places all their lives. In our study, for example, we asked questions, where were you born? And it turned out between 90 and 94% of the people in our study were born in the county where, in fact, the survey was conducted. So they were living in their lives all in the same place. And that was important in reference to this migrant business that I mentioned before. Very stable population, very different cancer rates, therefore measure as much as we possibly can measure and see what comes out. And this is just the plot here showing that original graph I showed. And at the bottom left-hand quadrant, you can see that the range we were working in was down there, where there wasn't really a big difference in disease rates. Almost every single study that's been done in the West and that you know about, we all know about, is done in the upper right-hand quadrant. It involves Western subjects where dietary differences are not really that different. They are different somewhat in terms of individual nutrients, but they're not that different in terms of animal food versus plant food. So I would suggest, in fact, that much of the confusion that we have had in the literature is based on the fact that we're working with Western subjects. Most of them are doing the same thing. Some minor differences, so we tend not to see things at the time that we expect to see. So the China thing was down in the left-hand quadrant. The Chinese, in fact, had also, as a result of their survey of 2,400 counties around the country, had published these very colorful, color-coded maps to show, for example, where cancer was high and where it was low. And in this case, it's colorectal cancer in women, and you can't see, I'm sure, the color code so well. But the red is where it's high, and then it's the purple, and then it's the light green, and then it's the orange, and so on down. So you can see that colon cancer occurs in some regions of China and not in others. And what was really quite rate regions and lowest rate regions were really remarkable. Here we can see, for example, for men and women, for these different cancers, that the range of mortality rates was several dozen-fold, a couple hundred-fold in a couple of cases. I mean, this is gigantic. If we see in the United States differences of, let's say, 1.5-fold or 2-fold, that's about all we're going to see. I mean, we're sort of a homogenized lot in this country, where we're consuming food from all over the place, and we're moving around, and so we're more or less doing the same thing amongst ourselves as far as diet and disease is concerned. But in China, where they were living in these very stable places, the differences in cancer rates were remarkable, as you can see there. And so the study was organized to include a total of 65 counties across the country to represent the entire population. And there were 2 villages taken in every county to make a total of 130 villages across the country. 100 individuals per county, or a total of 6,500 adults who we examined very carefully in terms of their blood, their urine, their food, and other practices, and their families. And here's some of the details of the kind of information that we collected. At the end of the day, we organized the study in a way that was done as carefully as could be done. We went into the home. When I say we, I'm using that term a little bit liberally because it's really my good friend, Dr. Chen Jun-Shi, who really managed this remarkable study in China, who was able to do this. But in any case, they measured very carefully how much of the individual foods were consumed, actually weighed it out, rather unlike what a lot of dietary studies are. We collected blood samples and urine samples, and we organized it in a way so we could actually validate our results, had them tested in various laboratories around the world, and could in fact check it that way. So we were kind of happy at the end of the day with the data. In fact, we ended up with a total of 367 items of information involving not only about a dozen different cancer rates, but also different rates for heart disease and diabetes and infectious diseases and a whole bunch of different kinds of diseases, as well as measuring a whole lot of things in blood, all the way from hormones to nutrients to viral activity to poisonous things like pesticides and heavy metals and so forth and so on. Fat intake in the United States, as I indicated before, is somewhere around 35 to 40% or so. Was then, still is more or less. In this study in rural China, their average fat intake was only 14% of calories. So they're really consuming a low-fat diet, a really low-fat diet. When I told you before that in earlier years we had sort of said, let's cut our intake down to 30%, obviously that wasn't much. That really wasn't much. I mean, here in rural China, their average is around 14%, at least the time we did the study. It ranged between 6% and 24%. So they're really consuming a very low-fat diet. And that's what one gets when they're consuming more or less a plant-based diet and not adding back a lot of oils and so forth. Fiber intake was about threefold higher, dietary fiber. And there's hundreds of different kinds of dietary fiber, by the way. We measure different kinds of fibers. So just on that basis, and of course, as I pointed out before, the animal protein concentration in the Chinese diet was only 1/10 what ours was. Those three things alone pretty well characterize the diet. We measured lots of other things too, but basically it shows that in rural China, they were consuming a diet largely plant-based, low-fat, high in fiber, and all the good things like that. And it turned out that blood cholesterol, which was a good indication of risk of heart disease, still is, was used then, still is these days. The higher the blood cholesterol, the higher the heart disease rates you see. It turned out the blood cholesterol levels in rural China were remarkably low. It went from 90 milligrams per deciliter to 170. These are means for different counties. These are not individual values. Individual values are as low as 50 or 60 probably. But as far as averages for counties, but between 90 and 170, the average was 127, unheard of here in the West. Their high was near our low. We range from about 170 to 270 or 300 or so, whatever it is. So, as a result of their consuming far less animal foods, they were getting much lower blood cholesterol levels, and of course, much less heart disease. Subsequent to this, Dr. Bill Costelli, who was the executive director of the Framingham study, met for many, many years, and Calder Esselstyn and others who have worked with people in this country, and using our data, in fact, have made the claim that they have never seen a person with heart disease who had cholesterol levels lower than 150. And indeed, in China, when we get down to levels of cholesterol that low, that we had, for example, the best case scenario, I guess, was a county where there was something like 277,000 deaths that had occurred, and not one of them was due to heart disease. So heart disease is virtually unknown in areas of the world where cholesterol levels are that low. The last two entries are related. Body mass index is an indication of body weight. And so what we see in the United States is a very high average body weight. Actually, it's a little higher than 25.8 right now. It's about 27.2. In China, it was about 20. So you can see, at least at that time, the average body weight in China, in rural China, was about only 3/4 of what it was here. It was much lower, about 25% lower compared to what it is here. In addition, and rather remarkably, these Chinese that had almost no obesity, no overweight problems, actually were consuming more calories per unit body weight. Now this was really quite of a striking thing. I mean, we tend to think, you consume more calories, you get body weight. Whereas in China, they were consuming more calories and getting less body weight. How so? Well, part of this clearly is due to the fact they're more physically active in China. than we are here. But we tried to control that as best we could. These figures are for the equivalent of Chinese office workers, who are the least active. And even so, the least active people are still consuming more calories and getting less body weight. Now, it's true that office workers in China are still more active than we are. They tend to go to the office, if you will, on bicycles. And so we have this sort of interesting relationship. They can consume more calories and gain less body weight. How so? Well, part of it is, I'm sure, and we can't distinguish and measure precisely how much is due to which. I'm sure that the extra physical activity helps to keep the body weight down. No question about that. On one hand. On the other hand, there's something else at work here. And that is when we consume low-fat diets, plant-based, it turns out that we can, in fact, consume a little more energy. Because much more of the energy that is consumed, the calories is consumed, instead of it going out into our body, gaining weight, if you will, it goes off as body heat. And interestingly, it also tends to stimulate physical activity. So people who use lower fat diets, plant-based, tend to have less body weight and tend to be more physically active, not just because they have less weight to carry around, but there is this kind of thing going on to create that phenomenon. This slide here is a summary of really quite a vast amount of work that we did, just looking at various specific relationships that we were just simply interested in. We wanted to know, for example, whether fat intake was related to breast cancer. It turned out the higher the fat intake in China, the greater the breast cancer risk. That was going from 6% up to 24%, breast cancer tended to go up. Really surprising. I mean, what was going on here? It wasn't a really strong relationship, but it was certainly statistically significant. It turns out that as fat intake goes up in China, it goes up because they're consuming more animal food. So the more consuming more animal food, and the protein and various other things tend to increase breast cancer. Age at menarche, the age at when a young woman reaches her sexual maturation. Age at menarche in China, average age at menarche in China is 17 years. The range was from 15 years to 19 years. In this country is around 11 to 12 years. Now what does that mean? Age at menarche is an excellent predictor of future breast cancer risk. The lower the age at menarche, the higher the breast cancer risk later in life. And why do people have low age at menarche? Why do they sort of reach this reproductive period earlier in Western countries? It's largely related to the fact that they're consuming diets that grow them as fast as we can grow people. So we tend to push our children to grow as fast as they can, give them a rich diet, and as a result, they reach the reproductive period early. I'm sure the same is true with males. It just so happens that with women, it's a little bit easier to get this kind of information. So in China, later age at menarche, earlier age at menopause. They are around 48, 47, 48 years. The Western woman is around 52, 53 years. What does that mean? Well, it turns out that in rural China, where breast cancer is rather uncommon, they have about 9 fewer years of reproductive life. And we measured this. It turns out that Western women, as indicated by British women in the particular case that we did, it turns out the estrogen levels, estrogen, you know, higher estrogen levels in blood tends to be associated with higher breast cancer risk. In any event, the estrogen levels in Western women is about 50% higher than in rural Chinese women. So we got two things going on here. In the Western women, we got a longer, more expansive reproductive period, number one. Number two, we got a 50% higher level of estrogen, circulating estrogen. That means the total exposure to estrogen, lifetime exposure to estrogen for the Western women is much higher. Much higher. You just do the calculations, area under the curve, if you will. Do the calculations, the estrogen levels in the Western women is much higher. Why are estrogen levels higher in Western women? Because of the diet. Consuming animal protein-based foods has been shown many times to increase estrogen levels. Switching to a more plant-based food, estrogen levels begin to come down. Colon cancer, fiber, it turns out the higher the fiber intake, the less the colon cancer. We sort of knew that from Western literature, but in China, here they're consuming these high levels, we see this. And so we go on down the line here. Vitamin C, it turns out, is only present in plant food. The higher the levels of vitamin C in the blood, to lower the stomach cancer rates. Each of these that I've listed here did involve very serious in-depth studies that were subsequently published. But the point I want to make, after doing this kind of work, sort of focusing on some of these details, is sitting back and kind of kicking your feet up and looking and see, what do we see? It turns out that almost every time we looked, we saw that the closer that these folks got to an all plant-based diet, the lower was the risk for these diseases. It was quite clear. And that, of course, was really very impressive because it involved people who were consuming not very much animal food and lots of plant food. So we ended up with comparing something like 50 or so these so-called exposure or outcome comparisons, cause-effect relationships. When we compared all of these things, as I said, it indicated that a plant-based diet was really good. And the remarkable thing was that it didn't take very much animal food. As I said, just going from 0% to 20% of total protein in the form of animal food actually elevated the risk. You can imagine, if we get that much increase in risk just going from 0 to 20, what are we doing now in this country consuming levels at 70% and 80% and 90%? So I had this final statement here: the richer the diet is in the kinds and amounts of nutrients provided by foods of plant origin, the lower is the risk for chronic degenerative diseases. Now, let me just go back and, before I conclude, just return to the original observation that was made that led in this country to so much information that was focused on just fat. This is the plot that I showed you first. The relationship between total fat intake, that's total fat intake, and breast cancer. If you look at this really carefully, and it crosses right here at the bottom, that line crosses the bottom saying that, some fat's needed. You're not going to get, we have to consume some fat. And then when we go above that level, we get into trouble with breast cancer. These data were actually prepared by the late Professor Ken Carroll at the University of Western Ontario, a friend of mine. And he published also some other data in addition to total fat. He had information on breaking it down, with reference to animal fat and plant fat for these different countries. And for animal fat, look at this. This relationship goes to the origin, so to speak, right to the 0 point. In other words, it says as soon as you start putting animal fat in the diet, breast cancer risk immediately starts going up. In contrast, plant fat, you don't see anything like that. So something about animal food or animal fat versus plant fat. But now, let me come back and make another point. Animal fat, experimentally, does not increase breast cancer risk like does plant fat. You say, what's going on here? This is really strange. This is a paradox. Well, in reality, when this information is explored a little more carefully, it turns out that the plant fat we consume, like corn oil, western oil, stuff like that, it can actually raise the risk for breast cancer and diseases, but only when the total fat intake is high. So the main point is to get the total fat intake down. So how do we get it down? Well, we don't do what we have been doing. We don't, for example, all of a sudden start consuming skim milk instead of whole milk. That doesn't work. We don't use lean cuts of meat and expect that we're going to get some benefit. And so you see where that message came from and where it went to? We focused on fat and telling folks, cut down on fat intake and use low-fat foods. And we also said, eat your vegetables and grains and fruits, of course, too. But people didn't do that very much. They thought by cutting out the fat intake, they were going to achieve something. And we were now learning it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The fat intake that I have shown you there, that's only an indication of something else going on. We can't conclude that it was fat. We should not have concluded it was fat. Instead, it's that. It's animal-based food. So had we plotted originally, when I say we, the scientific community, but in general, had it been plotted this way in the beginning, which is the correct way of doing it, we would have taken away the emphasis on fat and put it where it really belongs, and that's animal foods. And so animal foods increase the risk of these diseases. That's really what's going on, and it increases the risk of those diseases maybe a little bit because of the extra fat it contains, usually. But mind you, if you add a lot of plant oils in there and use fried foods with a lot of plant oils, you might get the same thing. So it's really animal foods, and within the animal foods or domain, the nutrient that really works best in increasing breast cancer risk and cholesterol levels is actually the protein. It's the animal protein. So it goes back full circle to what I was talking about in the beginning. Foods that contain animal protein, obviously it's animal-based foods. Foods that contain animal-based protein are the ones that cause us the problems. And it doesn't take much. It's just a very small amount for some people. We really need to be consuming a plant-based diet. I had the good fortune of then beginning to meet some people outside of the traditional scientific community. A number of people, including, I should say, Dr. Terry Shintani here at Hawaii, who has an international reputation, really an outstanding individual. He's one of your own, and he really is very good. But in any case, I had an opportunity to start to meet some physicians. I'm a scientist, I'm not a physician, so meeting some physicians around the country. Certainly heard of Dr. Bill Harris as well, although we had just met for the first time in this visit. In any case, there were physicians out there practicing and sort of coming to conclusions like what we were seeing in the research lab. And one of them, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn Jr. Dr. Esselstyn, how many of you heard of Dr. Esselstyn? Probably not very many. How many of you heard of Dr. Dean Ornish? Lots of people. Well, Dr. Esselstyn actually started his study a little bit before Ornish did, and decided to do his study over a longer period of time because he was particularly interested in doing it as long as he could. Dr. Esselstyn, by the way, is a surgeon at the Cleveland Clinic, very distinguished surgeon, president of his National Society, publications, lots and lots of publications, dozens of publications. He had actually gotten the gold medal in the Olympics before he decided to be a surgeon. He decided that all the operations he was doing, whether it was on breast cancer, he did a lot of breast cancer operations, heart disease and the like, they weren't really working as well as he might have liked and his colleagues might have liked. And so he thought there must be another way. I mean, they work to some extent doing heart bypass surgery and angioplasty certainly relieves pain, there's no question about that, and helps people in that way. But in terms of extending life, that information is not all that convincing. That was his conclusion, at least at the time. So he decided to do, and we didn't know each other, he didn't know about the kind of work I was doing and others were doing like me. He decided to get a bunch of heart patients and get them involved in this study using a dietary approach. And so he invited 24 seriously ill heart patients to join the study. He wanted them to eat a certain kind of diet. He wanted them to eat a low-fat, plant-based diet. He didn't talk about stress. He didn't talk about exercise to any significant extent. And he said, I want you to just do it in your home. You don't have to come to the clinic, just do it on your own. But I want to make sure you do it. And we're going to meet every week or two, and they did. And he took their blood cholesterol levels as he went along the way to make sure they adhered to it. These 24 people, 18 of them, decided to join a study. The other 6 said, no, it's too much for me, I'm not going to do that. So 18 decided to join the study. Now he has followed those 18 people for 17 years. Those 18 people, when they got in the study, had 49 coronary events prior to getting in the study. 49 coronary events for 18 people. They were really very sick. So they had 49 coronary events before they went into the study, and eventually, over the next 17 years, they went from 49 coronary events to 0. He basically brought under total control progression of heart disease for seriously ill people. In science, it has often been said, really aggressively for years, that although diet might help to prevent these diseases, it could not reverse advanced disease. It's too far along. What he, in fact, has shown, that's not true. Dr. Dean Ornish also did something very similar. He included stress management, exercise, and he published some results 1 year after he started the study and got the recognition that he got very quickly. But Dr. Esselstyn, a very sort of modest, low-key kind of man, did it for a long period of time and has gotten these remarkable results. The 6 people who did not join the study, they went on the American Heart Association diet. That's what doctors tell people to do when they have heart problems. They didn't get better. Their disease progressively got worse. The 18 people who were on the total plant-based, low-fat diet really got better. Now, I will just finish trying to answer that other question to give a more comprehensive view. If animal protein-based foods increase cancer risk, what about some other things? Well, animal protein had been shown in numerous studies, dozens of studies, as early as 1909, to be able to increase plasma cholesterol. Animal protein in human studies in Italy and Holland in the late 1970s was shown to be able to increase plasma cholesterol more than saturated fat, more than cholesterol itself. And what have we been told? We've been told, cut out saturated fat, cut out cholesterol as a means of reducing heart disease risk. That's not enough. That's hardly anything. What really matters is cutting out animal food altogether, because it's the animal protein that will increase cholesterol levels more than the saturated fat. Animal protein tends to increase a certain hormone called IGF-1. You probably haven't heard of it. Insulin-like growth factor 1. It's sort of the cholesterol of the cancer field. The higher the IGF-1 levels, the higher the cancer risk. And animal protein-based foods elevate it and elevate cancer. Also, animal protein increases calcium bone loss. If you do a plot, and it's been done, if you plot animal protein intake versus bone fracture rate for different countries, the higher the animal protein intake, the higher the fracture rate. And some years ago in the 1980s, it was done with calcium. The higher the calcium intake, the higher the fracture rate. Where do we get our calcium and protein from, mostly, in Western countries? We get it from dairy. If you plot dairy intake versus osteoporosis in different countries, the higher the dairy intake, the higher the osteoporosis. Dairy council have been telling us something rather different. And so I've had a recent opportunity to go back and look a little more exhaustively in some detail at the literature on some other things that I didn't know that much about, not in detail at least. And it turns out that this last sort of bracketed things, I put them in brackets because I think it's very good evidence. Maybe it's not completely settled yet in detail, of course, but it turns out that people who consume more animal food get more cataracts. And then something more serious, this macular degeneration. Macular degeneration is the chief cause of blindness in older people. And it turns out that macular degeneration, the macula is a little body at the back of the eye, at the center of the retina. It begins to degenerate when we consume animal foods. Alzheimer's disease, you know all about that. You've heard a lot about that in recent years. People who get Alzheimer's disease are people who consume more animal-based foods and build up that rather nasty kind of chemical that tends to build up in the brain and cause serious damage. Cow's milk, which is one of the animal-based foods and one of the more serious ones, I would say, as far as this effect is concerned, now is being shown to be related to the initiation of autoimmune diseases. And autoimmune diseases, let me name some. Type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is the kind that involves children straight off. They lose their ability to be able to produce insulin. And type 1 diabetes is very, very serious. It's where the immune system has been corrupted. It's been just been wrecked. And so it tends to turn against the body itself. Instead of attacking foreign agents that come into the body, it starts attacking tissues of our own and destroying our own tissues. Multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is now being shown to be tightly linked with cow's milk consumption. There's about 300 to 350,000 people in this country who have multiple sclerosis. It's about 1 out of every 1,000 people. We don't see them that often, but you know, I'm sure, it's a very serious disease. It was in 1976, in fact, in New Zealand, when they first published a show that if you compared cow's milk consumption with risk of multiple sclerosis, it was a relationship just like the dietary fat breast cancer phenomenon. We hear a lot, mostly anecdotal, I think, that cow's milk plays a fairly major role in the causation of childhood allergies as well. You'd be amazed what Socrates and Plato talked about. There's an account written 2,500 years ago when Socrates is trying to explain to his friend something about justice, and he focused on food. And he got a bit of an argument. At the end of the argument, his friend was saying, if he got rich, he was going to eat cattle. And Socrates said, what are you going to do that for? Where are you going to put the cows? It takes more land to produce the same food than it does just to eat it straight off from plants. I mean, incidentally, that's a really interesting observation, because a lot of scientists think they only discovered that in the last 20, 30 years. Socrates knew it 2,500 years ago. Anyhow, they went back and forth in this discussion. So his friend, finally Socrates says to him, okay, have it your way. Eat your cows. And in the future, he said, we're going to have a society that's going to be full of doctors and lawyers. 2,500 years ago. So I'm suggesting we need to have a new medical paradigm. And I say, for example, that whereas the major disease rates have not decreased in recent years in the United States, whereas medical care costs the highest in the world, we have the highest per capita medical costs in the United States. Germany is next, 60% of ours. Whereas food production is costly not only to our health, but also is environmentally unsound. Nutrition should be, will be, in my view, the major domain of medicine in the future. It has to be. Unless we start taking nutrition seriously, we're not going to be conquering some of these really huge problems, be they political, economic, cultural, philosophical, or whatever. If we consume a plant-based diet, rich in color, a variety of plant-based foods, and as lightly cooked as possible, maybe even lots of raw foods, not adding back a lot of salt, sugar, and fat, which we become addicted to. If we eat that kind of diet, the kind of gains that we can make in terms of our health are really remarkable. Thank you very much.